The following is an incredibly disturbing report made by a park ranger at Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada. The report was made on August 16th, 2020, and is comprised of the combined testimonies of Isaac and Clara Milton, a father and daughter who were off on a week-long hike in the mountains. Early in the morning of August 16th, park rangers found the two running through the forest while on routine patrol. At the time they were found, they could barely speak and were inconsolably upset. After returning them to the base and treating for shock, they were able to give their testimony. Both subjects relayed that they had intended to go on a week-long camping trip, just backpacking only and living on the supplies they carried with them. They had their sights set on a trail that led deep into the Rocky Mountains. The first few days of the trip were fun, but challenging. But it wasn't until after the first 2 days that they began to feel the strain of the ascent. By day 3, Isaac and Clara found themselves on Wild Bluff Pass, a winding walkway that climbs Mount St. Daniels, plateauing halfway before proceeding deeper into the mountains. When they reached that first plateau, about halfway up Mount St. Daniels, Isaac grew tired and the two took a break. Clara was amused to find a cave next to the trail, and the two explored the interior together. It looked to be a good place to camp. It had enough room for 2 cots, a natural dent in the rock for a fire pit by the cave's entrance, and a little deeper into the cave, around the right corner, a freshwater aquifer, which Isaac noted had no apparent bottom. Isaac removed the portable water purifier from his backpack and set about topping up their water supply. Clara wanted to continue climbing the small Mount Daniels and wasn't as tired as Isaac. Her father told her that he would wait there and make the fire pit, and the two split up. The peak of the mountain seemed like a reasonable distance away, and Clara anticipated that it would take her about an hour to get there and back, with plenty of time left over before dusk. "The snow-topped peak really called to me," she said, "and I wanted to experience conquering it. I set off walking diligently, not worried about how far away the peak was, but just focused on moving forward." About 35 minutes into the climb, Clara reported smelling smoke, and she turned around to see if down the mountain her father had the campfire lit, but the smoke appeared not to be coming from down the mountain, but rather from around it. Clara peered through the haze of distance and reported seeing some sort of flag or man-made structure, not at the top of the mountain, but along a different natural plateau where she now stood. Clara felt the need to investigate. It was further away than it looked, and upon arrival it appeared to be some sort of temple, with a few wooden straw shacks built up around it in a small village. She opened a map to confirm that there was no such place registered thereon. As she explored, all the huts seemed to be deserted. She found a book inside one that contained childlike drawings of animals and humans. Another hut contained the remnants of a smoldering fire, and she realized that this village must be populated currently. Clara felt reluctant to approach the temple, but as she did, she began to hear chanting from inside. The temple looked like it was carved right into the mountain face, and that its opening had been built around a cave. Clara climbed the stone steps and stood outside the entrance. Within, she could see several people that looked like monks. They were all in a circle, and there were about 12 of them. They were chanting in a language that she didn't understand, and it was almost completely dark inside, save for torchlight. Clara felt afraid. They seemed very devout and serious. It was very clear that they were not other hikers. They weren't government officials, and they had nothing to do with the park staff. Clara now turned to leave as quietly as she had come in, only to hear the scrape of 2 footsteps behind her. There were 2 monks on the steps behind her, both middle-aged Caucasian males, both having full beards and ragged hair, like they had allowed it to grow out indefinitely. Their faces were mutilated in asymmetric ways, possibly self-inflicted. Bits of nostrils or earlobes cut out in little triangles, long scars covering their faces as though the scar tissue had been reopened over and over again. They also wore long brown robes with a rope around the waist. Clara screamed and tried to run, but they were already too close. The monks grabbed her and dragged her into the temple, where now the others stopped their ritual and stood up to watch. On the far side of the carved room, she was taken down a flight of stairs deeper into the cave, and was imprisoned in a handmade wooden cage on the lower level. In a separate cage on the far side of the room, Claire was accompanied by another captured hiker named Stephanie. Park officials have not been able to identify her any more precisely than that. After the monks retired up the stairs, Stephanie had a lot to say. She was extremely shaken up, and claimed to have been captured alongside her boyfriend, Tyler, but that after a few days, Tyler was plucked from the cage and dragged up the stairs. Stephanie didn't know what had happened to Tyler, but she had heard his screams coming in from the upper level. Clara was horrified by this description, but neglected to mention the presence of her own hiking companion, believing that the monks might have been listening. Stephanie mentioned that it had been a few days since her boyfriend was dragged back up the stairs, and after recounting that bit of information, Stephanie had nothing else to say, but cried for a few hours, until monks came and dragged her up the stairs too, just as she had described. Clara was terrified for her life and made several attempts to open her cage, but all were unsuccessful, as the padlock, although shoddily constructed, was sturdy enough, as were the wooden bars. Meanwhile, back at their camp along the pass, Isaac had succeeded in getting the fire lit and was trying to peer up the mountain to see if he could see his daughter at the peak. At that point, only an hour had passed since the split, and he didn't feel particularly concerned. The two of them had been on several hikes like this, and he knew his daughter had all the basic survival skills. Isaac retrieved a granola bar from his backpack and came back by the fire to enjoy the view of the forest from halfway up Mount St. Daniels. As he viewed, he noticed some movement in the forest. He thought it at first to be an elk, bear, or a moose, because it looked large even this far away, and he retrieved his binoculars to take a closer look. It had patches of dark fur poking out between the trees, and it was absolutely huge. After another few seconds of watching, the creature emerged from between the trees. Isaac reported that the creature looked similar to a gorilla, but with more human-like facial expressions, and it was walking upright. The creature looked all the way up at him in the mountains, and turned to start marching up the steep slope towards him. A deep feeling of dread overtook him as he put down the binoculars and went to his backpack to ready a can of bear spray. Upon reaching the steep slope, the creature got on all fours and began lumbering up like an ape, climbing when necessary. As he stood by the fire, the creature never took its eyes off him. Isaac began to doubt if the bear spray would be effective and again retreated into the cave, hoping to catch it by surprise when it came around the corner. He could feel a rumble in the stone as it reached the plateau, and he could feel the draft disappear as it passed through the mouth of the cave. Isaac took this to mean that the creature was massive enough so as to nearly block the entire cave's entrance. In a moment of absolute terror, Isaac let go of the can of bear spray, believing it to be ineffective, and made a break for the watering hole, the natural aquifer deeper within the cave. He tread water there in the darkness, as what he described as the Sasquatch came around the corner with a grin on its face. It had to be on all fours to even fit into the cave, and it was something like 8 to 10 feet tall. It lumbered over to the aquifer, seeming to savor Isaac's fear. Its apparent intelligence filled Isaac with more dread than even its stature, and he dove below the water's surface just in time to avoid a long, hairy arm thrashing around and reaching out for him. Isaac was certain he was going to die, if not at the hands of the Sasquatch, then by drowning. In his desperation, he looked around in the water for some form of weapon or maybe a sharp stone, and found nothing, but noticed an extended passage in the rock under the water. Isaac took a gamble, hoping there to be an underwater cave, and his gamble paid off. He took the underwater tunnel in the pitch black and emerged in a cave where he found a pocket of breathable air. The circumstance took another turn to the fortuitous as Isaac realized his vest contained a pocket-sized waterproof flashlight. There were several underwater tunnels branching off from the cave. Isaac explored each of them in tandem, but found mostly dead ends. But at last he found a tunnel that wasn't blocked off, and proceeding through it, he found that it almost never seemed to end. He was terrified of drowning, but now had no choice but to proceed through the rest of the tunnel, and emerged in none other than the prison room within the carved monastery. There was a scream in the air as he gasped, which turned out to be Stephanie being dragged up the stairs. Realizing that he was in a new unwelcome circumstance, he dove back beneath the water, shortly after catching his breath, and then slowly peeked up to see his daughter trapped in a cage. The two were surprised to see each other, and were fortunate enough that with Isaac's Swiss Army knife he was able to pick the lock on her confinement. Even as they tried to keep quiet, there was a heated debate about which direction was the safest to flee in, and eventually Isaac convinced his daughter that risking drowning in the passage and then the confrontation with the monster was not something that they wanted to try. She conceded after admitting that right now the monks might be distracted with Stephanie. The father and daughter climbed up the stairs to the upper level, and to their luck, all the monk heads were deeply bowed in the center of the room. Stephanie was tied to a post, but before Stephanie was the Sasquatch. The monks hummed as the Bigfoot lifted Stephanie by her head into the air, smiling into her face with the same creepy expression, then poked his thumbs through her eyes as she screamed the most blood-curdling scream. He lifted her directly above his head and opened his mouth wide, crushed her head, and drank her blood. Isaac and Clara were sneaking behind the monks, trying not to pay attention to the horrors they were witnessing. Stephanie's body fell to the ground with a thud, and the Bigfoot looked around to see them. He roared and the cavern shook. Monks lifted their heads to assess what was going on and started chasing after the pair. They abandoned their camp and sprinted down the mountainside, tumbling over the ice and rock and getting scraped up. Both of them reported that they felt that the monks were right behind them, as was the Sasquatch, and when they eventually hit the forest, they just kept running into it, thinking they might have lost them, but not being sure. Isaac reported that at a couple points within the forest, he thought he had seen other tufts of dark black fur from between the trees. That was when we found them. Even during the interview, Isaac kept looking around nervously, like he was expecting one of us to be a monk or the Sasquatch to burst through the window. We had never heard reports of a monastery or any structure or village in that area of Mount St. Daniel's, but when we went to follow up on the report, we found that an avalanche had caved in the area and we were unable to explore it further. Thanks for listening, guys. Tune in next Thursday for a brand new short original horror story, and tune in on Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nightmare Theater, an open book club for nightmares. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.